friends, and really good to have your company this beautiful sunny evening. After a short break in our health equalities events due to the general election, we are now back, I'm pleased to say, and I am so excited to be joined by my amazing friend, the superstar Michael Rosen. I'm sure he needs no introduction, but I will try my best anyway. Aside from his work as a poet and an author, Michael has been a campaigner, a political activist, and tremendous champion of our beloved NHS. During the COVID pandemic, he found himself under the care of the NHS for several months, spending several weeks in an induced coma and several more in rehabilitation and recovery. Since then, he has been able to share his experience with all of us through his striking book, Many Different Kinds of Love, A Story of Life, Death, and the NHS. Through the combination of poetry and Michael's own hospital diaries, the COVID book gives a very unique insight into COVID from a patient's perspective. More recently, has published the optimistic book, Getting Better, which explores the theme, trauma and grief, but also what we can do to get through those darkest periods of our life. I'm so grateful to have Michael here today to talk a little about his life through the lens of health and health equalities. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Knowing how busy you are, I really am so grateful to you. But friends, before we start, let me just say, as I say each month, I want to have a session this evening to be as interactive as possible. So please do share your comments in the chat. So, Michael, again, thank you very much and a very warm welcome to you. And some questions now. We all know your strong passion for our beloved NHS. So tell me a little about your early engagement with the NHS and the impact that has had on you, please.
Yes, so I was born in 1946. So I was born 2 years before the NHS came into being. But as I was growing up, one of the ways I interacted with the NHS was to hear from my parents just how much it meant to them and how different life had been before the NHS existed. That they were both born in 1919. My father in America, my mother in the East End of London, and they grew up. Once my dad came to this country when he was 2, they both grew up in the London's East End. My father behind what is now the Royal London Hospital, my mother in Bethnal Green in Globe Road. And they always compared and contrasted what life had been like, trying to scrap around between charities and little insurances and that sort of thing, and the caution that people had about calling a doctor because of the cost that it was. They both came from working class Jewish households. My father, effectively the son of a single parent. And it was a matter of not of health for need, but health for those who could afford it. And if you couldn't afford it, well, you know, that was tough. And in fact, a tragedy happened in my parents' lives. They lost a son between me and my brother during the war. Now, whether that was, I'm not going to sit here and say that was because there was no NHS, but it was a moment, he died of whooping cough. And the way my father used to put it was they didn't have the medicines. That was the way he put it when he would explain it to me. My mother never ever spoke about it. So it was a secret in the house to a certain extent, rather strange circumstances. But that was the kind of shadow that my parents lived under and indicated to me growing up. My own experience was that we had a wonderful doctor who would visit the house, Dr. Kingsley, from North Harrow, who would come to our flat in Pinner if we were ill. And also I had reason to go to hospital several times. One, because I broke my nose playing cricket, would you believe? And so went to the Mount Vernon Hospital, which, as you know, probably this was one of the pioneers of plastic surgery because it was an RAF hospital. So those poor guys who came off planes with burns, some which would have meant they'd have been permanently disfigured or may even not have survived, then some of the pioneering plastic surgery was there. So it was a good place for me to break my nose near to the Mount Vernon Hospital because they knew what to do. And in fact, I remember the doctor, as I lay on the, just before I went under, he picked up a little hammer and he said, "This is how we're going to straighten your nose, Michael." And I remember thinking, golly, is he actually going to hit my nose with a hammer? Well, apparently he did. So anyway, but obviously they knew how to do it. That was my first encounter with the hospital side of the NHS. And my next one was much more serious. I was knocked down in the road, again, very near to Mount Vernon Hospital, about 400 yards away from Mount Vernon Hospital. Again, a very good place to get knocked down, and broke my pelvis. And I was in hospital for 8 weeks and in rehab for 2. So I got to know Mount Vernon Hospital very well, in a ward that was split between those of us with bits of broken things, one way or another. What do you call that? I forgot what you call it for a minute. I was going to say orthodontist, but it isn't that. You'll remember the name anyway, when you get broken bones. And the other side was what they used to euphemistically call UG. Those of you who know anything about hospitals, that's your rhinogenitals. So there was a very strange experience for me, but wonderful in its own way. Another aspect of the NHS is that you meet all people, all levels of people. This is not a ghettoized way of treating the population. So as it happens, on my side were mostly young folks, some of whom had motorbike accidents. And on the other side were guys who had bladder complaints and those things that afflict older men. And so it was quite an interesting ward with an interesting clash of cultures. And I could see the care going on in that ward where I was for all that long, apart from the fact that I misbehaved, but then I was only 17, so you might expect me to misbehave, mightn't you? I won't tell you that story, it's too disgusting. And yes, and then I had to learn how to walk. So, of course, that was my experience coming off the end of being in an induced coma for 40 days. I had to learn how to walk again. So I've in fact learned how to walk 3 times in my life. Once as a baby, once as with a broken pelvis. Well, it had healed by then, of course, and once coming off the end of COVID. So, and I've had many other experiences with the NHS down through the years. They saw my dad out. They brought into life. Well, I've got 5 biological children, 2 steps. 2-step children, so they've all been brought in to life with the NHS. I've had the NHS informing me tragically how my son died. I lost a son from meningococcal septicemia, and had great help from GPs and so on, telling me what happened and why and how. So there we are. That's a little brief survey of my encounters with the NHS, and as you say, the most profound and lengthy has been this last one, which was in March, April, May, and June 2020.
I'll come back to that in a moment, Michael. And by the way, Mount Vernon in Northwood is pretty, much going, caring for the local population, and something that we in Northwest London are particularly proud about. But let me just continue, Michael, and ask about that early engagement and motivating you to become a passionate campaigner, which you have become over past several years for the NHS. So perhaps tell us what led you to becoming that passionate campaigner.
Well, in part, it was my parents and the way they talked about it. They were active members of the Cooperative Wholesale Society, the co-op as we call it. They were socialists, and they believed that that's how we proceed. Best way to proceed, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, and that the NHS was a beacon for them. And they would explain to us very clearly, me and my brother, they would explain to us that this was the best way that we could do it, because it treats all human beings as equals, but also not as equals in terms of their need, but that society can progress if those with the ability, and maybe that means intellectual ability, it might mean financial ability, helps those without that, according to need, which might be illness, it might be poverty, it might be other things. And so the NHS was of itself something that they saw that way, but it fitted into a general philosophy about how society could run. And they were quite clear about that, that society could progress through cooperation, teamwork, and whether that came top down from the state or from the ground upwards was always a matter of debate. And they did debate those things. I guess sometimes they were quite dirigiste, I believe is the posh French word for talking about top-down ways of doing these things. Well, some things have to be dirigiste in the sense that if you want an NHS that's national health service, then that has to be organized. But as became clear, in particular during COVID, is that actually you need local organization and local control. If you say everybody's going to be vaccinated, well, you know this better than me. And I'm of the era that I come before vaccinations, mass vaccinations, and then they came in with polio and TB and so on. That if you want to organize these, then you have to give power to the localities and enable people to create committees and organizing principles so that these things can be rolled out. So you have to get a balance between the top and the bottom and make sure these things work for the benefit of all. And I've seen that unfold through my life. So I guess that's been part of it. And also, I'm very, very concerned about privatization. It seems to me that if we privatize chunks of the NHS, we are in effect handing over millions to people who are nothing to do with the NHS. These are the shareholders who sit there, and famously they've been called coupon clippers. That's to say they sit with their shares coupons and basically wait for the dividends. And then they take their dividends and say, thank you very much. And that money is money that is not in the NHS. It is in their pockets. And that seems to me quite wrong. I don't think that's how we could or should run the NHS. If we say, well, rich people can be able to provide private healthcare or whatever, well, find channels in which they can do it. That's otherwise known as taxation. Or if you really want to do it through charities, then they can do it through charities. But there shouldn't be a system where they can actually make profits out of the NHS. But it's a trick because they're on guaranteed dividends. You just sit there milking what is in fact our money that we pay for the NHS. They just say, thanks very much, I'm on 5%. I've invested in, let's call it, I don't know, Mediops or something, Mediops company. I've invested 100 grand, 10 grand or something. And at the end of the year, I walk away with 5%, 6%, 7% as guaranteed by the government to hand over our money, that's the country's money, to those folks who haven't done anything. I mean, they've just sat there. And this seems to me quite wrong. We need every penny we can to go into the NHS for all its services, all its people, all the machines and the plant and the buildings and everything else in order to provide the best possible healthcare that we can to the country. I mean, as people have said, what's more important than people's health? It's our life, our lives and our life. So, it should be at the core, at the center of how we think about society. And that's how I feel about it.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. Michael, I'm just going to pause with my questions, and let me take one from our friend Amel. Really good to have your company this evening. What's your question to Michael, please?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I've got a couple of things to say. I was also born in 1946, and I was also born in France. In France, you actually have a social security where you pay a certain amount of money, and then you get it back through the administrative system. And if people are not able to actually afford the system, then they have it for free, which I think is the way that the English system should go, because what happened in 1948 is no longer feasible in 2022. Dr. Rosen was very sort of enthusiastic about the NHS. So I just want to know, why is the NHS not in the Heathrow villages in the south of the borough of Hillingdon? Never have been, never have given any services. And from it looks at it, will never have any services. So we don't have any services. It's not equal.
So I don't think, I don't think Michael is in position to answer a specific question of that nature. But of course, Michael can speak very general based on your earlier point. And Michael, I don't know whether you want to comment on the first part of our friend's contribution. Thank you very much, Amel.
Yes, bonjour, madame. Merci beaucoup pour votre question. Yes, the French system, I know a little bit about the French system, and it does seem to largely work. That's good that it works. I mean, if I was in government, I would look at any state-run system and see whether there are ways of improving the way we run our NHS system. But I would exclude from that, first of all, as I've said, the whole notion of private investment. I would try and also exclude private healthcare, because in the end, private healthcare drains the state system, because the state trains the doctors who then divide what they do between private health and state health. So I'm not in favor of that, but I know I wouldn't win an election on that. So, but anyway, that's what I think about that. So yes, I think the issue about whether people get free health and some people have to pay for it, it's quite well known across the world that if you create what are in effect means tests for people to have access to whatever service or benefit, what happens in the end is that there is a layer of people, sometimes numbering in tens, if not hundreds of thousands and sometimes more, who do not benefit from that service, or if it is a benefit of some sort, they don't benefit from it. It's a bit difficult to explain why and how, but it's a well-known mechanism that means testing. It all sounds terribly fair, and the service that you've described in France is a form of means testing, because some get it back and some don't. Some are paying, some are not. And there is a problem about that, about the way that works. But yes, but overall, if it seems that there are great advantages to some aspects of the French system, I would totally be in favor of it. Yes, absolument, madame, absolument.
Thank you, Michael, for that. Michael, just a moment ago, you talked about your son. You sadly lost your son, Eddie, at a very young age. I think at the age of 18, if I'm not mistaken. Michael,
yes.
Eddie's death was inspiration for your book, Sad Book. What was it like writing about your grief? And how did you remain so positive? Because I know, Michael, how important kindness is to you.
The thing, people here, I no doubt have all experienced grief of one kind or another. And, you know, it is one of the features of our lives. Our problem is that we love each other. We love our partners, we love our children, and this is a great mistake. I'm saying that ironically. So that it's in a way a kind of mistake, because then if you lose that person, it's a great grief. But then that is, you know, one of the paradoxes. It's part of the human predicament. So in answer to your question about writing about it, well, everybody has to find their way to handle grief in whichever way suits them. And for some people, it might be gardening. For some people, it might be dancing. For some people, it might be meditation. Some people to deal with it religiously, to see somebody from their faith group and so on. Many people find different ways. But for me, writing is one of the ways. You know, people talk about the talking cure. It's a quite nice shorthand phrase. I sometimes think about, well, writing has been a great help to me, and also doing. That's to say, well, after Eddie died, I was working on short-term contract at the BBC, and I had people around me who were very kind and caring, and they didn't probe or demand that I somehow or other perform grief, as it were. Far from it, exactly the opposite. They would just very kindly put work my way. And it was, I very much appreciate that, because whether they knew it or not, I'm somebody who kind of acknowledges and benefits from what we might call the doing cure, of which writing is one. You feel you're doing something when you're writing. You're churning things over, you're coming up with phrases and narratives and stories and passages of writing, and it feels very active to me. It does. It doesn't feel like a penalty. No one's standing over me like we had at school and telling me I've got something right or wrong. And so it feels very active, and that's a very pleasurable process. And part of the pleasure comes in trying to get the feeling right. It's quite hard to explain, but if you have feelings, one of the hard things to do is to put it into words. So if you're talking to your friend or your partner and you struggle to put it into words, and then somehow or other, when you write on a page, it can almost be even harder. But at the same time, it's got one of the great advantages: it's slow and you can correct it. So when you have one go at it, you can go, no, I don't quite mean that. I don't quite mean that I feel lost. I mean, rather that I can't go on or something, let's say. So you correct it, or you add bits, and you can change bits. Whereas when you speak, as I'm speaking now, I can't correct what I just said. I can just say something later to say what I mean. But the nice thing about writing is you can go on perfecting it. And, there's not many art forms that are like that, where you can sort of correct it and then other people don't see it. So if you're painting, it's quite hard to correct a painting. If you dance, you've danced. If you've sculpt, then you've only got that amount of stuff to sculpt with. So obviously that all varies, but all I'm saying is writing has got that nice correcting possibility, and that feels good, because what you're trying to do is make the feeling authentic. You're trying to grapple with it and what it is that you want to say, and that is a relief. In fact, I call it a relief and a release. It's both. You can decide which of the two. As you're releasing, so are you relieving. Relief and release, release and relief.
Thank you. I've just seen a little comment from Heather, and Heather, I'll bring you in, and colleagues, if anybody, friends, if anybody do want to ask a question to Michael, please do indicate, and I'll try and bring you in. Michael, talking about grief, I think we all have our own stories of grief, particularly during the COVID. And as you may know, I lost my dad and my brother during the pandemic. And Michael, you too were admitted to hospital, as we heard you mentioned earlier, with suspected COVID, and remained in ICU for several weeks. And you have movingly spoken about NHS workers and the role they played in keeping you alive. And again, how did you remain so positive during this particularly very difficult time?
My experience was quite strange, in that I was admitted in emergency. My wife rushed me to the hospital as directed by a friend and neighbour who's a GP, because you remember at the time, this is, let me get the dates right, somewhere around about March, late March 2020, you couldn't see a doctor and you couldn't go to A&E. Things had got so bad and a bit chaotic. So all you ended up doing, as I did, was to ring the paramedics, which was a bit unfortunate. I rang and they said, breathe down the phone. And so, I breathed, and then they'd say, cough. And I coughed, and they said, is your coughing getting worse? And I said, I don't think so. And then the guy said, well, I don't think you've got COVID. And then I did that the next day, and I think possibly for the third day. But it was my wife who thought that I was getting very, very ill, and called our friend, the GP, as I said, and she had an oximeter on her, the GP friend, and she gave it to Emma, my wife, and Emma put it on my finger, and Katie, the doctor, called out and said, what's it read? And Emma said, 58. And the GP said, no, that's probably the pulse. What's the SAT level? And Emma said, no, the pulse is 115. The SAT is 58. Well, later, Katie told us she'd never seen anybody conscious with a SAT level that low. So she said, get Michael to the hospital quick. Don't wait for an ambulance. So I was rushed off. And in fact, if that hadn't happened, that little set of circumstances, I wouldn't be here now. I was plunging deep into oxygen deficit, into hypoxia. And so I went in, and to start off with, I thrived. They gave me a CPAP, I think, and I was all right for a few days, but then I suddenly dived again. And the last conversation I remember having was with a doctor by the side of my bed. And he's saying to me, will you sign this piece of paper, which will allow us to put you to sleep? And I said, will I wake up? And he said, you've got a 50-50 chance. And I said, and if I don't sign? He said, 0. So I thought, well, I better sign then. So I signed. And then that's the last I remember for, well, it's about, my wife and I discuss it, but it seems like about 45 to 50 days. I'm just out of it. So the huge care that I had in that period, I'm in ICU from doctors and nurses and other health workers. I can trace it through my notes and through this wonderful patient diary that I have that the nurses filled in nearly every day that I was in ICU. The care is just incredible and under such huge strain. I mean, I've heard from Professor Hugh Montgomery, the consultant in that ward, that 42% of us were dying. The ward was overcrowded. It was equipped for 11 bays, as they call it, as you know, probably. But there were 24 patients in there. There were nurses running between patients, sometimes looking after 2 or 3 patients, which is, nowhere near the guidelines. The guidelines are there must be 1 nurse to every patient. And so they were making the best they could of it. And Hugh has used the word carnage, that the death rate was higher than they'd expected or knew about. And the first shock was one that they weren't ready for, was that COVID was causing blood clotting. So though the people were presenting with a respiratory disease, gasping for air like I was, in actual fact, out of view, as it were, clotting was taking place. No one is exactly sure why this happens. So, for example, I had 3 blood clots in my pulmonary artery and microclots in my brain, and probably some kind of capillary problems in my toes as well, because I lost my toenails. They were just bloody big toes at the end. So all this was going on, and the doctors and nurses rushing to keep up with this new illness that in some respects looked like a form of pneumonia. I mean, I don't mean in terms of what kind of virus it is, that it was presenting as a form of pneumonia. There were these cytostorms going on, and then these other effects, one of which is my eye and my ear, both of which got knocked out, probably by the microclots. So in the ICU, my eye, I don't know whether you can see it, but the eyeball is dilated and permanently fixed. It can't respond to light. In fact, I don't think I blink with that eye. So the way Hugh put it was, we thought you were brain damaged, because I was showing the signs of that. So they're busy trying to cope with this multifactorial illness, a multi-symptom illness, and trying to keep up with it. And I can see that, it was just an incredible time. And also I know from conversations since, the provision of the PPE was absolutely terrible. And we know this from the latest statement that's come from the inquiry. The government had lost the opportunity to provide proper PPE, which they'd got from that feasibility study they did. Is it called Cygnus, Operation Cygnus? When they had the opportunity to, in fact, equip hospitals ready for pandemics, which look like they may well be a regular occurrence, tragically and awfully. And the health workers, the first on the line, weren't ready for it. And for that matter, with some other public service workers, like bus drivers, who didn't have proper shields in their buses. So the viral load of passengers getting on and breathing on them was much higher than it needed to be. And I know in London buses, there was a a very big spike in the mortality rate of those bus drivers in those first few weeks of the pandemic. So there's plenty of things that people have learned and need to learn. And going back to my point about the importance of the local provision of health, that the strengthening of local committees to run the health service, I think that's emerging as more and more relevant, that you can't run health from the top down. You can send out directives, you can have policies, but in terms of delivery, that has to be local because that's where people live and work. So somehow or other, you have to respond to that. And after all, we knew this about education. I won't go down there. We had local authorities. They've been undermined, but anyway, I won't go there. Well, we need the equivalent to be beefed up and to be strong within the health service as well. There've been various efforts about that in the past, I know. So there's a little glimpse of my thinking from that period.
Thank you very much for that. The care that you received was provided by my colleagues, my friends at CNWL, Central and Northwest London NHS Foundation Trust,
yes,
and our chair, who has recently retired, has joined us this evening, and I'm delighted to see her on my Zoom screen. Professor Dorothy Griffiths. Dot, really good to see you now this evening. Thank you very much for your company this evening. Always good to have your company, Dot. Thank you. Martin, you got your hand up. Really good to see you as well, Martin. Your question to Michael, please.
Yeah, hi, Michael. Good to see you again. Yeah, my question really is about what was going on during that period of COVID within the government, and things that were being said about older people, things like they've had their innings, etc., etc. Perhaps if you're a few years older, it might have been more different for you, given that kind of attitude that there was, if you were a few more years older at the time. It was almost like assisted dying done by government rather by agreement with the medical authorities or whoever. I mean, I'm a believer in assisted dying, in dignity in dying and so on. But it does make you think in the future, with the older population increasing in time, what kind of rationing, etc., of treatment or medication or whatever might occur in the future. And I wonder what your feelings are about that, and particularly about your feelings about what was being said at the time about that older generation.
Thank you for that, Martin. Michael, please.
Yeah, well, I think several things were going on at the same time. There was a kind of new folk wisdom, if I can call it that, but I'm put that inverted commas because there was nothing wise about it, but a folk wisdom that emerged, and we can speculate as to why it was, that was the opposite of how people usually talk about old people. That they talk about their parents and grannies for their kids and all the rest of it with great affection. And suddenly, in fact, I remember going on the radio, on the Today program on the radio, even as I was just probably getting ill. And because I think I'd tweeted about the fact that I got the impression that people were saying that us old people are expendable. And so it somehow or other mattered less that a person aged 70 might die of COVID than if someone was 30 or 20 or 10. That there was some new kind of league table emerging about the value of life. And so I went on the radio, and I remember sitting next to a woman who was about my age, and we were being interviewed by Martha Carney on Radio 4. And I said what I've just said now. And then she said, well, if somebody's got to go, then I hope it's me and not my son, my grandson. And I remember thinking, well, death doesn't work like that. In the old days when we used to think there was Mr. Death, and Mr. Death came knocking, and then you kind of, in the folk stories, you bribe Mr. Death. You go, no, take the dog. Or, Mr. Death, I'll give you this, I'll give you that. It's a nice fantasy that medieval people and other cultures have made up, that you can negotiate with death. And here was somebody in the 21st century sitting next to me in a radio studio, in effect playing that game of saying, well, you know, if death's going to come, take me, not my son. Well, you know, there's no choice about it if there's a pandemic. So we've got a kind of various kinds of folk wisdom going on. Now, to my horror, just before I got ill, if you go back to the, well, you can see my article on it, if you like, on my blog, is that on one day in the middle of March 2020, 3 government scientists came on the radio and the telly quite separately, came on and talked about herd immunity. Now, just to be clear about this, they talked about it, saying that this is the way that we would solve this problem of this pandemic, herd immunity. And for 24 hours, 48 hours, it seemed as if that's what the government thought, that's what the scientists thought, until they suddenly changed their mind. Now, just to remind ourselves what herd immunity is. Herd immunity, when you have vaccinations, that makes sense. You immunize the herd, the population sitting in front of you, whether that's a herd of cows you've got, or pigs, or chickens, or whatever you do, you immunize those animals. And indeed, that's what we did with polio. But the idea of herd immunity in this circumstance, they were suddenly seemed to move the goalpost. They were talking about, and it was quite clear, that somehow or other, if the majority of the population got infected, the death rate would not be bad enough to worry about. And anyway, those who die would be old. Now, this was in the air, there's no question of it, for I would say 48 hours or so. Boris Johnson, in fact, articulated it. He articulated it on telly and in various other places. He had already articulated it in February with a rather obscure speech he gave, where he talked about how he was against market segregation. Very obscure phrase to mean that he was against a public health policy to deal with illness, which seems an extraordinary thought. But this idea circulated, and there's no question of it, to my mind, is that it was in the air for a moment, a form of eugenics, that people above a certain age, it really wouldn't matter if they died because the young population would be saved. And of course, this obscures all sorts of problems. It's crazy biology because, as we know, the virus mutates. As we know, there's a differential way in which people respond to the illness, whether you're young or old. It doesn't deal with the clinically vulnerable. It doesn't deal with all sorts of other vulnerabilities around, young or old. Doesn't deal with viral load, another problem, because they weren't talking about social distancing and masks at that time. So they were just blithely carrying on with a viral load. There were great big spreader type events like the Cheltenham horse racing and a Liverpool, I think, an international match. There were no restrictions on travel. So they were quite clearly working with this idea that there would be an acceptable death rate. And this horrifies me that that could have been entertained, and at quite a high level, and also by 3 scientists. I mean, I can name them. Well, I have in my article if you want to see it. And I think there's been some fudging about it in the inquiry because they've allowed one of the witnesses to just simply say that we didn't really mean it that way, and I'm sorry we ever spoke about it. But I think that's a fudge. I think they seriously did entertain it. You can look at the 3 interviews. One was on Newsnight, one was on the Today programme, one was somewhere else. And they really did think that would work. And, you know, we know biologically the way immunities arise most safely in populations is what's called vertical immunity. That's to say through evolution. That's to say through the thriving of resistant members of a population, mating and producing members who thrive against whatever is this outside bacterium or virus, and those who don't die off because they're killed by that virus or bacterium. So vertical immunity, you know, relatively, for example, has happened with rabbits in the face of myxomatosis. But at this, at the death rate of hundreds of thousands, if not millions and millions of rabbits. And anyway, of course, rabbits breed much faster than human beings. So the idea that there was going to be feasible herd immunity seems to me a terrible idea, terrible that it was even thought of. And there was this level of eugenics in its attitude to old people. And I'll just finish this with, as quite a famous journalist, a woman, she was mocking the idea that there's such a thing as long COVID, or indeed that people had suffered quite badly with COVID. And so I put up a satirical tweet. I just said, oh, yes, I wasn't really ill. I was just hiding under the table. So it was just meant to be satire. And she came back at me and said, oh, yes, Michael. No, we know you were ill, but you were 74. And I remember thinking, in her mind is that word but you're 74. As it happens, she was 66. So she could have in her mind a difference between her age 66, me age 74. And so somehow or other, my likelihood of dying was a but. Well, what do you expect? You're over 74. Well, now I'm 78, so I've had 4 years of life. She's had another 4 years of life. Are my days less valid than hers? So this is, what we're going to have to do, and I don't see it happening yet, is actually talk about what we think older folks' lives are for and about, and how do they matter, and in what ways do they matter. I don't think this society's had that conversation at the moment, and I still see it on Twitter, the most horrific things said about old people. You would think we were criminals, or just supernumeraries, or just somehow, I don't know, robots or something that you could just chuck on a scrap heap. I mean, just quite extraordinary. And you just wonder, do these people talk about their grandfathers and grannies like that? Do they talk about their mothers and fathers who are doing maybe lots of childcare, or I don't know, asking for help, doing all sorts of things? Well, I don't need to tell you. Do people, are they talking like that out there now? So I think there needs to be a real big discussion, talk about that. We need a big conversation, as
Thank you,
Prime Minister James Callaghan once put it.
Thank you for that, Martin, and thank you for that very comprehensive response, Michael. Michael, after that amazing care that you had from CNWL, you did get better, and thank you to all the colleagues at CNWL. And in your book, In Getting Better, you implied that coping is an everyday practice. We are coping even when we are unaware. We are coping, and perhaps especially in those moments. So tell me, Michael, how do you cope?
Well, I'm very wary of sounding too preachy or sanctimonious or offering people blueprints. At the end of the day, you've got to work things out, either with yourself, with your loved ones, or with your friends, how you work it out. And people will do it in lots of different ways. And one of the ways I do it, as I've said, is through thinking and talking and writing and doing, finding things to do, being given things to do. So that's all one aspect of it. Another is, I'm not a believer. I don't have any faith. I believe in human beings. So I believe in us and the usness of us, that we have our own power to generate ourselves and generate ideas. And so realistic, if you take stock of that and you say, well, what does that mean? If I don't look outside any deity, no superstitions or astrologies or anything like that, and you say, well, if I've only got me, what do I do with this me? So one of the things that I say is that I have to find things that give me pleasure. That's one thing, obviously, but also can give me cause for hope, that I can be proud of, things that are, and it can be very, very small. And believe you me, I'm not talking about winning the Olympics or anything like that. It might be, for example, when I came out of hospital, I was having a lot of problem remembering things. So I would set myself a little challenge that when I went to the supermarket, it didn't necessarily write the things down. Would I remember the things that I had to get at the supermarket? So I had a little thing in my head. I got to get eggs, hummus, cat food, and bread. So on the way to the supermarket, I'd be saying this over and over again. And then when I get in the supermarket, I'd concentrate, try and remember it. And then, of course, the first few times I'd come home and I'd have forgotten something, and I'd get quite distressed about it, because I did think that I was possibly losing my memory, that the effect of this illness was that it had, and because it had affected my brain, illness or the ICU or both. So I was a bit distressed about it. So I set myself these challenges. And when I got it right, and I did remember the cat food, yes, I found myself congratulating myself. And it sounds incredibly trivial and silly, but it really isn't, right? And hanging on to that thing, no matter how small, and making sure that as I closed my eyes and went to sleep at night, I would concentrate on it and remember it, so that I had, if you think of an image of a man in the water, perhaps worrying that he's drowning and grabbing a piece of wood or a piece of a raft so he doesn't go under. In a way, it was a bit like that. And that's what for me, I'm avoiding being preachy and blueprinty, that for me, that's one of the things that I do. I hang on to that good thing that I can be proud of that happened in this day. And as a poet once said, days are where we live. So our lifespan is day by day, I quite often think. I mean, some people might say it's minute by minute and hour by hour, but for me, our lifespans are in days. So rather than thinking, what will I do this week or this month or this year or this decade, to be much more limited about it and think in terms of this day I did. Sometimes it involves planning. Tomorrow I will do. But that aspect, and just to finish, our daughter, she said to me about maybe a couple of years ago now, she looked at me and she said, "Dad, you're an optimistic nihilist." And I said, "Oh, what's that then?" And she said, "Well, you're a nihilist because you don't believe there's anything other than us. You don't believe in a deity or other forms outside of us, supernatural beings, but you're optimistic about it. You think each day that there's a reason to be hopeful or optimistic." So I thought, oh, well, that's lovely. Our daughter went to university. She's educating her dad, me. That's lovely. I've got a phrase that I can use to describe myself. So I'm very grateful to our daughter, Elsie, for giving me a phrase. And I've tried to express it to you now, that how that works, that it can be something very small, or if you're lucky, it could be a big thing. I write, as you know, so if a book comes out, then I feel, whoa, or I finish something off, or I don't know, it could be, a lovely experience.
Michael.
So there's it.
And Michael, very briefly, and talking about being hopeful and going, let me just remember your poem. Now, a very famous poem, in fact. These are the hands, as well as your tribute to the NHS workers, has been key part of your ongoing campaign work. So with the new health secretary in the office, are you more hopeful, Michael, about our NHS? And a very brief reply, because about 1 hour, as it always does, is fast coming to the end.
I'm overall optimistic, but I have been concerned that Mr. Streeting seems to be talking quite a lot about private finance. So as I expressed earlier, my concerns about that, I don't see why we as taxpayers, as a country, should be shoveling money towards people just because they've invested money. I just don't see the point of that. And so I'm concerned about that. So, but overall, and obviously he's just today, they've just made the settlement with the junior doctors, and I think that's fantastic. That will stop that crisis from carrying on. So I think, 3 cheers for that.
Great stuff. And a very quick question. I just wanted to bring the young voice into the perspective. So in your unexpected twist, which perfectly captures the way young people speak, but how do we perfectly capture and address the health inequalities amongst our young people, Michael?
Oh, wow. That's a difficult one. Yes. I mean, if we can be proud once again of the NHS, if we can explain health, remember, it wasn't called the National Illness Service. It wasn't called the National Disease Service. It was called the National Health Service. And I've seen just in the press this last week, people remembering this, that in actual fact, a nation that is thinking about illness and death and life must think about health. It has to think about how we secure everybody's health. Now, at the moment, health is very differential. We know that paint a broad stroke, poor people are less healthy than people who are better off. Why should that be? Why should that be? And why should that apply to young people as well? And so I would hope again that government would take this, because I mean, you know, if we want to spend less on a national disease service, you have to make it a national health service. You have to really go all out and talking about diet and fitness and what it is the human body can take and what it needs and so on. And not in some authoritarian way, but in a very pleasurable way. And I think that I would hope that this government's going to get the bit between their teeth and think about that in the way that at the very beginning in 48 people were thinking about that. That's why we had free orange juice and free cod liver oil. You know, I remember queuing up with my brother, you know, while my mum tipped cod liver oil in her mouth, you know, blah. But goodness me, you know, there we are popping cod liver oil. You know, what have I got in the other room if I haven't got vitamin D tablets? You know, and there was my mother tipping cod liver oil into me, you know, when I was 5 and 6, free, let it be said, and free orange juice because they took it on. And they also took on the health, you may be interested to know, by setting up a chain of state subsidized cafes because they were so worried that the calorie count was going down in the British population. They set up what they called British cafes or empire cafes. And I remember going with my mum to one in Pinner, just to the edge of the Memorial Park, because that was the way people thought in 45, 46, 47, 48, 49. These are our people. How do we create a society for and with our people? That's how the state education service expanded, and social services and so on, and the NHS. Well, we've got to get back to that level of consciousness. If you're going to talk about inequalities and you're going to talk about health, then we have to go back to that way of thinking in whatever practical ways that we can do it.
Thank you very much. Michael, 1 hour was never going to be enough. And unfortunately, our time is fast coming to end. And I do want to, within a very short period that we have left, I am going to bring back my colleague, Cleo. It wouldn't be right not to get you involved in some form of a poetry competition. And with you as this iconic poet, it's only fitting that we bring you in to this part of our work. So Cleo, let me just bring you in very briefly then, please.
Thank you, Ketan. Yeah, I think we were inspired by having Michael with us here this evening to relaunch the Advocacy Project's poetry competition, which is something that we used to do annually. And I think it's really just an outlet for those among our community who do get some joy or strength in the creative process. So we're taking up the theme of tonight's event, which is survivor stories. And we're asking anybody who is an unpublished poet to go ahead and submit a poem on that theme by the end of the summer, so by the end of August. And most exciting is that we will have Michael Rosen helping us to judge the winner of that competition. So thank you for that. Don't worry about grabbing a pen. I'll be sending out all of the details to everybody who might want to get involved. But yeah, hopefully some of you will be excited to join in on that.
Thank you very much indeed. George, it's really good to see you. Don't really want to put you on sport. It's always a special joy to have you join us. And I wonder whether you have a very final question for our dear friend Michael, knowing the closeness that over the recent years that has grown between the CNWL family and Michael.
I guess, I mean, you have put me on the spot a bit, but I guess my question for Michael would be, how does he think we can best support the staff of the NHS? Because he spoke very movingly about how they had helped look after him. He mentioned the junior doctors' difficulties, but the dispute being settled. But the staff in the NHS are tired. They're under a lot of pressure. They're tired, and at some level don't have a great deal of public support in the way they did earlier. Yeah. So
perfect question.
Apart from your wonderful poem, which made a huge impact on CNWL, what else do you think we can do
A perfect question to end on. And of course, that poem, These Are the Hands, Michael, what I've just referenced a moment ago. It would be really amazing to finish with your response on this particular point, please, Michael.
Yes, it is a great question. I wish I could think of a great answer. I mean, the way I've tried to do it is to respond to every invite that I get, whether it's been from the Royal College of Nursing or the Royal Society of Occupational Therapists or anaesthetists, and to tell my story. I'm not sure the NHS over the years has thought through how it could create patient healthcare worker alliances, if you like, or communities. Inevitably, with a system like this, by and large, what we do is we go into it, and then when we get better, we come out of it. Those who have got lifetime issues, well, then obviously they are there. And I've had many conversations with doctors and nurses where they said it's been great to hear a patient's story. And I think, well, I can't be the only, I'm not the only patient, you've had millions. So there's some way in which this connection between health workers and patients, and indeed carers of patients outside of the hospitals, that somehow or other that link is not there in any formal way. There used to be local health councils, I think.
Yeah.
And you could elect them, couldn't you? Because I remember there was a woman in our street was on the board, and she used to say, you must vote or something like that. Well, I don't know whether this government would think this would be a good thing to put back in place, given that one of the key things that came out of COVID is that you must have local action and local observation, local care, local, say, action taking place, that maybe some kind of structure will emerge as a result of the inquiry. So that's my first thought off the cuff.
Thank you very much indeed for that brilliant question, Dodge, and that brilliant, equally brilliant response. I'm going to bring back Cleo for the final closing remarks and the details about our next month's session with Andy Bell. Thank you, Cleo, and thank you very much indeed, Dodge, for letting me put you on spot as always. Thank you, Cleo.
Thank you. Well, thanks once again to Michael for such an insightful hour. Thank you, Ketan, for making these events possible. And thank you to everybody for being here with us this evening. Expect to hear from me over the next few days with the recording, details of the competition, and all of the information about next month's event. I hope you have a good rest of the night. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much again. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye.